Have you ever seen a tiny spark set an entire neighborhood on fire? For us, it all started with something as simple as roses. My wife had planted them by our porch, a small touch of beauty she loved. But to Karen, the HOA president, they were a violation. Days later, a letter arrived demanding a $250 fine. My wife didn't even hesitate. With quiet strength, she said, "I won't pay for something that isn't wrong." That single refusal was enough to pull the mask off. Karen, she wasn't just a neighbor with a clipboard. She was someone drunk on power, determined to control everything around her. And when she couldn't break us with fines, she dialed 911, certain she'd humiliate us. But nothing could have prepared her, or me, for what happened when the officer arrived. Looked at me and froze. His voice trembled as he whispered, "My commander?" It was a quiet morning when I first noticed the letter taped to our front door. At first, I thought it might be a friendly note from a neighbor, maybe a lost dog flyer or a community event announcement. But the bold letters at the top made my stomach tighten. Notice of violation. I opened it slowly, my wife leaning over my shoulder to read along. The letter claimed that the roses she had planted in the small patch of soil beside our porch were unauthorized landscaping. For that, the HOA had decided to fine us, $250. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Roses? Of all things, roses were the problem? My wife shook her head, almost laughing. They're flowers, not a fence, not a shed, not a swimming pool. Just flowers. I'm not paying for this. There was a fire in her eyes, the kind of quiet strength I'd always admired about her. But I knew Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood did. She was the self-appointed queen of our subdivision, walking around with her clipboard like it was a scepter. She thrived on catching people in tiny infractions and making their lives miserable. To her, power wasn't about community, it was about control. That evening, I watched from the porch as Karen strutted down the street, scribbling furiously into her papers every time she passed a home. My wife stood by me and whispered, "She's going to make this into a battle." I wanted to believe otherwise, but deep down, I knew she was right. Sure enough, the very next morning, Karen came marching onto our property uninvited. She didn't bother with greetings. Instead, she waved her clipboard like a weapon. "You have 24 hours to pay that fine. Rules are rules. No exceptions." My wife crossed her arms and calmly replied, "We're not paying for flowers." Karen's face turned crimson. The veins in her neck pulsed as she pointed a finger just inches from my wife's face. "You don't get to defy me. This community has standards, and if you won't follow them, then maybe you don't belong here." Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. The tension crackled in the air. And then, in an act that would set off the storm to come, Karen pulled out her phone, her voice shrill with authority as she barked into the receiver. "Yes, police? I need an officer dispatched immediately. We have a situation." At that moment, I realized this wasn't about roses anymore. It was about power, pride, and control. And my wife had just challenged the wrong person. The air felt heavy as Karen ended her call with the police. Her chin lifted in triumph like she'd just won a war. My wife and I stood silently on the porch, neither of us willing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, my heart raced. I had seen conflict in my life before, real battles, real enemies, but this was different. This was pettiness sharpened into a weapon. Karen stayed planted at the end of our walkway, pacing like a guard dog. She spoke loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear every word. "They think they're above the rules. Not in my neighborhood. Not while I'm in charge." Each word was designed not just for us, but for an audience she needed to remind of her so-called authority. My wife, still calm, went back inside and poured herself a glass of water. She looked at me, her voice steady. "She wants a scene. If we argue, she wins. If we stay calm, she looks like the fool." And she was right. But Karen couldn't stand the quiet strength. She stomped up the walkway again, clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. "Listen," she snapped. "When the police arrive, I'll make sure they understand exactly what kind of people you are. If you think you can ignore me, you're mistaken." Her voice cracked slightly, a sign that beneath her bravado was fear. Fear of losing control. Because that's what this was all about. Control. She had built her little empire on intimidation, and now someone had dared to say no. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Neighbors had gathered discreetly on their lawns, pretending to water plants or walk dogs. But really, they were watching the drama unfold. Some of them pitied us. Others, I could tell, were secretly cheering for us, though none dared to say it out loud. Karen's reach was long, and nobody wanted to be her next target. The distant wail of a siren broke the silence. Karen's eyes lit up with satisfaction, as if salvation itself was arriving. She crossed her arms, smirking, muttering just loud enough for us to hear, "Now you'll learn what happens when you disrespect the rules." I felt my wife's hand slip into mine. Her grip was firm, steadying. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we don't back down." I nodded, though deep inside I braced myself. Karen thought she was about to see us crumble under the weight of flashing lights and uniforms, but what she didn't know was that fate had just set the stage for a twist she could never have imagined. The sound of sirens grew louder until finally, the flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street. A patrol car pulled up right in front of our house, tires crunching against the pavement. The neighbors who had been pretending to be busy suddenly leaned in closer, eyes glued to the scene. Karen straightened her shoulders, victorious, as though the cavalry had arrived solely for her. Two officers stepped out. The younger one, maybe mid-20s, adjusted his cap nervously while the older officer walked with a calm, steady stride. Their presence carried weight, the kind of authority Karen thrived on. She marched toward them, waving her clipboard like it was evidence in a trial. "Officers!" she called out loudly, her voice dripping with righteousness. "These people are disturbing the peace, violating our community's standards, and refusing to comply with the law. I demand you take immediate action." The younger officer raised a brow, glancing at us, then back at her. The older one didn't rush. He simply studied the situation, his eyes moving from Karen's wild gestures to my wife's calm expression, and then finally to me. My wife whispered under her breath, "Just stay calm." Karen wasn't calm. She was in full performance mode. "They've planted unauthorized landscaping. They mocked the HOA. They're refusing to pay fines. If you let them get away with this, it will ruin the entire neighborhood." Her voice cracked as she gestured dramatically toward the roses by the porch, as if those flowers were dangerous contraband. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly wondering why he had been called over a dispute about flowers. But the older officer, his gaze lingered on me. It wasn't casual. It wasn't professional curiosity. It was recognition. I saw the way his steps slowed, the way his expression shifted from neutrality to something far more personal. His jaw tightened, his eyes searching mine as though confirming a memory long buried. And then it happened. He stopped dead in his tracks, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Sir, Commander?" Karen blinked, confused. She whipped her head toward the officer. "What? No, don't listen to him. I'm the HOA president. I called you. Arrest them already." But the officer wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me. Recognition flooded his face, the kind of recognition that carried respect, history, and weight. My heart thudded. My wife squeezed my hand tighter, and in that charged silence, I realized this wasn't going to end the way Karen thought it would. Time seemed to freeze. The older officer stood there, staring at me as if he'd seen a ghost, his hand lowered slowly from his belt, his shoulders squaring, his expression shifting from neutrality into something sharp, something familiar. "Commander?" he repeated, this time louder with a tremor in his voice. Karen's smug smile faltered. She looked between us, baffled. "Commander? What are you talking about? He's just some stubborn homeowner who thinks the rules don't apply to him." But the officer ignored her completely. His eyes didn't waver from mine. In that instant, my mind traveled back years, to endless drills, to desert heat, to the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. This man standing before me had once served under my command. I remembered him then, young, determined, a soldier who had trusted me with his life. Now here he was, in a uniform again, but in a very different battlefield. My wife's lips parted in surprise as she realized what was happening. The younger officer looked between us, confusion painted across his face. But the older one, he snapped to attention in a way that made it clear. He hadn't forgotten who I was. Karen's voice screeched through the tense silence. "Officer, do your job! Arrest them! They're defying the HOA, and I called you here. You work for me right now, and I'm telling you—" The officer spun on her so suddenly that she stumbled back a step. His voice, steady but edged with steel, cut through the air. "Ma'am, I don't work for you, and you will not speak to my commander or his family that way." The crowd of neighbors gasped audibly. Phones lifted higher. Suddenly, it wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. It was something much bigger. Karen's face flushed an angry red. She sputtered, "Key Commander? What nonsense is this? He's nobody." The officer stood tall, his voice loud and clear now. "He's not nobody. He's the man who led me, who kept me and others alive when it mattered most. Show some respect." My wife squeezed my arm gently, her eyes shimmering with pride. Karen, meanwhile, looked like her world had tilted. For the first time since this feud began, she wasn't in control. I met the officer's gaze and gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we shared. He nodded back, standing at my side, not against me. And in that moment, everything shifted. The woman who thought she ruled. The neighborhood had just realized her power meant nothing here. The silence that followed was heavier than the summer air. Neighbors stood frozen at the edges of their lawns, their phones raised, their mouths hanging slightly open. Karen's authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling right in front of them. The older officer turned fully toward me now, his voice carrying the weight of deep respect. "Sir, you don't need to explain a thing. I know exactly who you are, and I trust you." Karen's eyes bulged. "What are you saying? Trust him? He's breaking HOA rules. He's mocking the community." She stomped her foot like a child denied candy, her clipboard shaking in her fist. The younger officer looked unsure. He leaned toward his partner and whispered, "What's going on? Should we, handle this?" The veteran officer shook his head firmly. "No, we're not here to enforce HOA fines. That's not criminal. That's civil. This call was unnecessary." Karen gasped, her voice turning shrill. "Unnecessary? Unnecessary? I am the president of this association. You have to listen to me." But the older officer stepped forward, his tone sharper now. "Ma'am, I listened. And what I see is not a crime. What I see is a homeowner being harassed." Those words hit like thunder. Neighbors exchanged looks, some smiling behind their phones. Karen's face went from red to pale in seconds. She jabbed a finger at the officer, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. If you don't make an example of them, no one will follow the rules. The community will fall apart." The officer folded his arms, towering over her. "The community isn't built on fear, ma'am. It's built on respect. And from what I can tell, you've forgotten that." My wife let out the faintest sigh of relief, her grip on my hand loosening slightly. I could feel her pride radiating through her calm demeanor. She didn't need to gloat or speak. Karen's unraveling said everything. Still, Karen tried to salvage her grip. She turned to the crowd, shouting desperately, "You all know the rules. You know I've kept this neighborhood in order. Without me, this place will collapse into chaos." But instead of support, silence met her plea. Eyes avoided hers. No one stepped forward. The officer finally looked back at me and my wife. "You're fine here. If this happens again, call us. Harassment isn't something you have to tolerate." Karen's jaw dropped. Harassment. The word echoed like a verdict. For the first time, she realized the badge wasn't in her corner. The queen of the HOA had just been dethroned, right in front of her entire kingdom. Karen's face twisted with disbelief, her voice trembling between rage and desperation. No, this isn't right. You can't talk to me like this. I'm the president of this HOA. I decide what happens here, not you." Her words cracked the air, but they didn't carry the same weight anymore. The officer's calm defiance had shifted the entire scene. She was no longer the authority. She was the spectacle. The younger officer cleared his throat awkwardly, murmuring, "Ma'am, please lower your voice. The neighbors are—" "The neighbors!" Karen spun toward the crowd, her arms flailing. "Don't just stand there. Tell them I'm right. Tell them we can't allow these rule breakers to destroy our neighborhood." But instead of agreement, she was met with silence. Phones stayed up recording. A few people shook their heads. One woman even muttered under her breath, "About time someone stood up to her." Karen's eyes darted wildly, as if searching for an ally and finding none. Her voice rose higher, cracking with hysteria. "You're all ungrateful. I've given my life to keep this place perfect, and this is how you repay me." The veteran officer stepped forward, his tone stern but calm. "Ma'am, that's enough. You've called us out here for a non-criminal issue. You've disrupted the peace far more than this family ever did." Karen's breathing quickened. She jabbed her clipboard at me like it was a weapon. "This isn't over. You'll regret this. I'll take this to the board, to the county, to the courts if I have to." My wife, still composed, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but cut sharper than any yell. "All this over flowers? Roses, Karen, do you hear yourself?" The crowd stirred. A few chuckles escaped, quickly muffled. Karen's face burned crimson, her authority unraveling thread by thread in the eyes of everyone watching. The younger officer finally broke his silence. "Ma'am, you need to calm down before this escalates further. If you continue, we may have to treat you as the disturbance here." That stopped her cold. The idea that she could be the one accused of disturbing the peace left her, momentarily speechless. Her mouth opened, then closed again, her hands shaking. But even in that silence, I saw it in her eyes. Karen wasn't done. She would retreat, regroup, and come back swinging. People like her never let go of control easily. As the officers prepared to leave, my wife leaned into me and whispered, "It's over, isn't it?" I shook my head slowly. "Not yet. For Karen, this is just the beginning." For a few days, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers about what had happened on our lawn. Videos of Karen's meltdown made their way through group chats, even outside our subdivision. Every trip to the mailbox came with curious stares, some sympathetic smiles, and a few quiet thumbs up from neighbors who had clearly been waiting years for someone to stand up to her. Karen, however, didn't retreat quietly. She doubled down. Flyers appeared on doors with bold headlines. "Protect our community, say no to rule breakers." She tried to frame us as villains, claiming we were destroying the integrity of the neighborhood. But this time, nobody was buying it. The videos told the truth louder than her flyers ever could. Then came the letter, delivered not by Karen, but by the HOA's own attorney. It wasn't addressed to us, but to the entire community. It explained that Karen's actions, including her misuse of HOA funds to hire legal threats against homeowners, had exposed the board to serious liability. The attorney's tone was clear. If Karen continued, the HOA itself could face lawsuits. The reaction was swift. At the next board meeting, normally a dull affair with empty chairs, the community center was packed wall to wall. Neighbors who had never spoken out before stood up, one after another, recounting their own experiences. Fines for trivial things, threats for minor infractions, intimidation at every turn. For the first time, the fear of Karen was gone. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Karen was removed from her position as president. Her gavel, once slammed with so much self-importance, was set down quietly, taken from her hands not by force but by the very people she had ruled over. As for us, the roses remained. Every morning, my wife watered them with a quiet smile, as if each bloom was a symbol of resilience. Neighbors began planting their own flowers, some even calling them freedom gardens. What had started as a petty fine had grown into something much larger, a reminder that community should be built on trust, not fear. One evening, as I stood on the porch, the officer who had recognized me stopped by on patrol. He gave me a small salute and said, "Glad to see you're still leading, sir." Even here, I returned the salute with a smile. Because he was right. Sometimes leadership isn't about battlefields or uniforms. Sometimes it's about standing your ground, even over something as simple as roses. And in the end, it wasn't just Karen who lost. It was the fear she thrived on.